Taoiseach and Minister for Foreign Affairs especially, Ireland has a considerable reputation when it comes to our development aid programme, because that programme has been doing invaluable work, because it makes a difference. It's poverty focused, it's about community empowerment, and it's really directed at the most marginalised, and it has been untied. So going forward, especially with the new white paper coming, my question is, how committed are we to policy coherence, particularly when we're seeing examples of policy incoherence? And I'll just take one example on tax. And at a previous leader's questions, I outlined a number of steps where each positive step that we took in relation to tax transparency was accompanied by a backward step. And the policy incoherence is giving the aid, but then not following through on the tax justice for the developing world. At a recent event in Dublin, the Rwandan ambassador made the point that $63 billion in illicit flows goes out of the developing world, and that is more than foreign direct investment and aid going into those developing countries. So real policy coherence would see Ireland taking meaningful steps in relation to tax justice. And you may say, yes, that we've got rid of the single malt, and that is positive, but it's not going far enough, because what was needed was to take the steps that the BEPS process has designed to really tackle the underlying problem and prevent replacement structures emerging. The policy incoherence is also seen in relation to trade treaties, the imbalance between the developed country, what it gains, and the very minor gains for the developing world. And if we take the Ireland-Ghana tax treaty, it prevents Ghana taxing the capital gains of mines, factories and large businesses owned by Irish companies. There was no spillover analysis done prior to the treaty, and so that allowed for that example and other examples of unfairness. And what's really shameful is that, because of our aid reputation, countries in the global south, they want to trade with Ireland because they trust us. And I know that our embassies and our ambassadors are working on these trade relations. So are they on that page of policy coherence? Now, I know there's a role for the private sector, but the danger is that it's moving away from this coherence. You know, I ask, how committed are we to including binding human rights agreements, rights standards and environmental standards when we are negotiating these treaties? And I would ask about where we are in terms of implementing our business and human rights policy. When we were discussing the EU-Colombia trade agreement, we were assured about these human rights agreements, and yet since then we've had land grabs, we've had forcible displacement, we've had exploitation and intimidation of workers. We have the scandal of the Kerry-on mine, the role of the ESB, and the fact that CMC, the coal marketing company, is registered in Dublin. So if we were committed to policy coherence, I think we would be implementing our business and human rights policy. So my question is, where will the white paper be on policy coherence?
Well, 3 minutes.
Well, a lot of good questions there. I mean, first of all, the white paper, Deputy, to update you, is more or less complete. In fact, I'm reading drafts of it now this week to look to finalise essentially a new Irish aid, Irish development strategy, which will have quite a lot of new thinking in it, as well as building on a lot of the very good things that the Irish aid programme has been doing for decades. We're also planning for a very significant monetary increase in terms of the supports for our overseas development programme. In the latest budget, we have facilitated an increase of €110 million on what the previous budget had allocated across the broader development ODA space. As you would expect, Deputy, in the new white paper, we will be prioritising areas like gender equality, reducing humanitarian need, climate action and climate resilience, strengthening governance in different parts of the world, and there will be new areas and a new focus on increased funding for areas like education for girls, new initiatives around sexual and reproductive health and rights. We'll see new funding streams around women's economic empowerment. There'll be a focus on building a new Institute for Peace and Leadership training and support here in Ireland. And a whole series of other issues, a bigger emphasis on island states and climate resilience linked to that, given the fact that we're an island state ourselves. So there's been a long and detailed consultation process in the build-up to trying to finalise a new strategy which will have increased funding over the next decade, and will have new areas responding to the obvious challenges that I think get debated in this House regularly. And I look forward to your commentary on that. And of course we need to try to ensure that domestic policy in Ireland is also consistent with what we're trying to do elsewhere, whether that's from a climate perspective, whether it's from a gender perspective, whether it's from a reproductive rights perspective, or indeed whether it's transparency in relation to taxation to ensure that large multinationals pay their fair share of tax. I think Paschal Donoghue and the Taoiseach have been very clear on that. And there is an ongoing international debate on how tax reform should take place, and Ireland is very much part of that.
For a supplementary.
The consultation process that took place. But I think, surely aid is about getting to a point where it's no longer needed. And for aid to have a sell-by date, that means the developing world having the capacity to lift themselves out of poverty. And that means that as well as giving the aid, we're also supporting them in their capacity to collect taxes from the multinational companies who are making a fortune in those countries. And it also means being fair to them when it comes to the tax and the trade treaties that we are part of. And to me, that's real policy coherence. So we could end our opt-out of Article 14 of the OECD multilateral instrument, which is a measure against tax avoidance, and we could insist on our tax treaty partners that they would sign up to Article 4, and we could insist on binding human rights and environmental safeguards. Policy coherence is not a dreamy romantic ideal. It is something that can be realised, and it's actually a stated aim of the Lisbon Treaty. So the incoherence is in giving the aid but not taking the steps which could actually see an end to the need for aid. So we'll wait and see what is in the white paper, but it's more about having the words, it's about the action also.
Margaret Taoiseach, 1 minute.
Well, I think the aid programme is all about action, Deputy. And I know you know a lot about the Irish aid programme because you take an interest in it. Anybody who takes the time to visit some of our programmes, particularly in the continent of Africa, but also now increasingly in the Middle East as well, will know that it's all about action and actually getting to the people who need it most. And that is why I think we can more than justify a significant increase, step by step, over time, in the amount of funding that we provide for that development aid programme between now and the end of the decade. In relation to the hope that aid wouldn't be needed in the future, I would share that hope, but I think it's a dream at this stage, a long, long way from a reality. We have, at the moment globally, and people can correct me on this, but my understanding is about 134 million people are currently reliant on international aid and assistance. 134 million people. We have millions of people in refugee camps, millions of people on the move, economic migrants and migrants fleeing conflict. And so you will see, I suspect, an increasing focus on those incredibly vulnerable people. And unfortunately, there is a broader link. This isn't just about economic development, it's also about stabilisation and post-conflict management, which Ireland will also be focusing on.
Now,